A small storm of explosions engulfed the courtyard outside the main palace. Roland's spider golems unleashed another volley, arcs of azure fire streaking across the night before bursting into waves of concussive light. Each impact tore apart ghouls in droves, scattering limbs and abyssal blood across the stone. For every creature annihilated, two more clawed their way up from the earth, and their writhing heads twisted unnaturally toward the lone defender. The armored runic knight commander stood tall amid the chaos, his fortress of stone under siege. The spider golem cannons thundered without pause while his rock golems slammed fists and spears into the swarm, each strike cratering the ground and causing further wreckage in the courtyard where the battle raged. Roland focused on the higher-tier cultists who were tearing through the golems he summoned from his spatial armor pocket. His mana drained constantly, but for now, he had enough. The main foe, the Abyssal Witch, watched from the edge of the battlefield, likely waiting for him to tire. That gave him time to think. How had they gathered so many cultists here? This place was supposed to be well protected. Nothing is making much sense. It became clear that things did not add up. The number of hidden enemies was enormous, and the weakness of the Duke and his guards suggested he had walked into a different kind of predicament. A few theories ran through his head, but none of them helped his immediate situation. For now, the only way out was to destroy the relics hidden inside the watchtowers, and for that, he needed help. One of his golems hovered in the grand hall, focusing on an old mage who sat lost in thought. Anzanuz raised an eyebrow as he glanced at the hovering construct. It was peculiar and unlike any runic device he had seen. He seemed fascinated by its shape, but a loud noise from outside snapped everyone back to the gravity of the situation. The battle still raged around them. Most of the cultists who had been fighting in the grand hall had been drawn away. That left this small group wearing shining runic bracelets. It was now up to them to deal with the occult relics scattered around the castle grounds. "You know what I desire?" the old man asked while stroking his long beard. "Indeed. If you promise to aid me, I will help you gain priceless knowledge from the famed inner library of Yavana Arvanduz of Xandar's Institute of Wizardry. You know the Lady Archmagus?" The old man stammered in surprise and his eyes bulged for a moment. "I do," Roland replied while commanding his golems to press the attack. He knew that for mages such as Anzanuz, magical knowledge was the ultimate currency. He could not ask Yavana directly for permission, but he had access to the library and could put in a good word for the mage. Regretfully, he could not prove the claim, and he knew the old man would be skeptical. "Preposterous! Why would Senior Arvanduz be involved with you? How can I believe such a claim? Come, young lord, we should depart." The old mage snapped at Roland's golem before looking to Tybalt Valerian, who already seemed eager to leave. The others watched the exchange with equal distrust. Roland had woken them from a dream and told them to perform a mission. He could not expect a pompous old mage or a sheltered noble to obey without resisting, but he would not let them refuse. "I am afraid that is not an option. You will have to excuse my rudeness, Lord Tybalt." "What do you?" Tybalt opened his mouth to protest, but the glow in his bracelet wavered. The runes etched into the device rippled like dying embers, then the light faded. His eyes widened in horror as he realized the bracelet's true purpose. He tried to force mana into it and failed. Then, out of desperation, he began to shout, but it was already too late. "No, wait, you cannot do this to me, I'm..." The lordling tried to shout but his body froze. His expression was now locked as his consciousness was pushed back into the cult's illusion. The young lord twitched once and went utterly limp. Luckily, Arthur was there to catch him and eased him to the ground. "You would do such a thing to a young lord? Are you mad?" The old mage was furious and ready to cast a spell on the hovering golem. The only thing that held him back was the fear he was now feeling, a fear from the man who controlled his fate. "My apologies, but the situation requires your aid. Either you help me, or I have no use for any of you," Roland said in a cold, harsh tone. He meant every word. If he let them go, they would likely hide or reach a barrier and become trapped anyway. In this dire situation, blackmailing a noble was a risk he accepted, better than dying here. "Without this bracelet," the old mage murmured as the truth sank in. "Yes. Without my help, you will be pushed back into the cult's illusion. Now decide, will you help me or not? There is no time left." This time it was not a request but a statement. Silence fell in the grand hall. For a heartbeat, only the distant thunder of the courtyard battle echoed and grew louder. Anzanuz's jaw moved. The old mage's eyes shifted between Roland's hovering construct and the dormant runic bracelets on the wrists of the noble he served. He had lived long enough to recognize the words of coercion, and he understood that nothing he did could stand against it. Very well. I hope you will keep your promise, but first release the young lord. I knew you would see reason. Not as if you gave me much of a choice, young one. Once the bargain was struck, the bracelet lit up again. Tybalt rose from his slumber, still confused, and needed a few moments to realize that his mage had accepted the deal. Master Anzanus, you cannot. It is fine, young lord. We have no choice, and it seems this person carries some kind of plan, so it may be wiser to listen to him. Now speak. What do you wish us to do? Simply follow Lord Arthur. He will lead you both to the cult relics. You will face resistance, but the three of you should be enough. As soon as he said it, everyone in the chamber who was still awake turned to Arthur. Tybalt and Julius did not look pleased that their youngest brother would be the one to lead. The rest of you, take the Duke into the inner palace. The defenses there should be strong enough to withstand the cultist assault. Roland went on with the explanation. The inner palace, the place the Duke had entered through, remained untouched and showed no sign of infiltration. Only members of the Duke's family could open the path forward, and even in his weakened state, the Duke could likely manage it. Wait! Before the group could divide, Julius raised his voice in protest. Lady Bernadette stopped mid-step, and all eyes turned to him. He stood straighter now, no longer hesitant. It was clear that he had listened to the conversation and had reached a decision. I will not sit idle here and let this filth destroy the Valyrian palace. I am coming with you. Arthur blinked, caught off guard. Brother Julius, perhaps it would be better if you stayed with father in the inner palace. You will. No. Julius said firmly, his jaw tightening. You will not order me to cower behind walls while my home is at stake and is destroyed by this cultish filth. Julius pronounced while raising his long sword. I will join you in this battle. My honor as a paladin and knight demands it. Lady Bernadette gave an approving nod, but not everyone shared her resolve. The bestial warden remained silent as he hoisted Theodore over his shoulder and walked toward the great doors of the inner palace. Tybalt and the two guards who had been roused carried the Duke back as well, and in this way the group divided. The guards bore the Duke on their shoulders while keeping close on either side. Although awake, he was disoriented and in no condition to act. Good, they are on the move, but can I hold out until they finish? Roland was still struggling against the massive horde. He could not at first understand how so many cultists had managed to get inside, but it was clear that magic had been involved. The holes from which the creatures were emerging looked familiar, and the mana signature reminded him of the tunnels he had explored after the culling. It seemed that during the culling, the cultists had been slowly moving closer to the castle. He had already discovered during his last expedition underground that the cult was working behind the scenes. Many of the remaining monsters had contained a type of worm, a mutated strain unlike the ones used to infect humans. The culling itself had been nothing more than a manufactured dungeon break, most likely a distraction meant to cover the digging below. Even though the Duke was a Tier 4 class holder and the castle was thought to be an impenetrable fortress, there was still a way inside, and that way was through the ground beneath it. No one had expected the dungeon to bore through hardened lava rock to reach the palace. Luckily, for some reason, these monsters were not very strong. Roland suspected that this might have been intentional as well. He studied the swarm of ghastly abyssal creatures circling around him. His golems were somehow managing to hold the line while Arthur and the others pressed the attack on the first watchtower. Yet he knew of a certain ability that could change everything. If his suspicions were right, this swarm of Tier 2 monsters would soon grow much stronger, but he had ways to prevent it. Roland's sensors pulsed with warnings again. His visor shifted and displayed a web of mana fluctuations across the battlefield. What he saw confirmed his theory. The ghouls that had been defeated were melting into a purplish miasma and a strange liquid. The substance clung to the remaining monsters and fused with them. Their levels surged, and the more he killed, the closer they came to reaching the Tier 3 threshold. The monsters advanced in an endless wave, growing stronger with each loss, and he had no way of knowing how many more were left. Nevertheless, there was a way to avoid this, and he refused to wait a second more. In theory, this should be enough to disable the parasite's powers. When Roland first discovered this new type of parasite, he brought it back to his workshop for study. With the samples he collected, he managed to devise a few countermeasures against their vile energies. Now it was time to test his invention. If he delayed, he would be overwhelmed before Arthur and the others cleared the first watchtower. Roland's armor shifted with a grinding hiss as plates slid over one another. Hidden layers split apart, and the massive pauldrons on his shoulders revealed circular compartments. From within each compartment, a pointed cylindrical device slowly rose. Runes flared to life across all 6 before a burst of force launched them into the air. They flew outward like miniature missiles, arcing through the night before embedding themselves in the ground. At first, nothing happened. Then the mechanisms activated. Runes glowed as the pointed cylinders began to spin. One by one, they burrowed into the earth, safely hidden from prying claws and detection. Good, they are in. Good that these monsters are practically brain-dead. Their numbers are the problem, but this should fix it. He had realized during this battle that his opponents lacked intelligence. Many of the creatures trampled over one another, unable to comprehend even the simplest tactic. They behaved more like a natural landslide than an army. The witch's eyes narrowed, tracking the points of contact with suspicion, but she was already too late. The cylinders activated, releasing waves of energy that rippled invisibly across the battlefield. Their presence could only be marked by expanding rings of light on Roland's visor. As soon as the signal stabilized, the ghouls reacted. The writhing, tentacled creatures staggered, spasming as though their senses had been torn apart. Their signals flickered and dimmed on his display. The abyssal ooze clinging to them writhed and peeled away as if driven back. Impossible! The witch hissed, her many mouths producing a chorus of voices. The merging of the monsters had been stopped, though the ordinary abominations still pressed on. Roland's new invention, the abyssal parasite disruptor, was working. It could not destroy the parasites within the flesh of the living creatures, but once a monster was defeated and reduced to sludge, the parasites inside became exposed. In that vulnerable state, they could be targeted with a precise frequency that caused them to rupture. Once the parasite at the core of a creature was truly destroyed, it could no longer fuse with others, ending the cycle of unholy empowerment. To ensure safety, this device did not rely on holy energies to disrupt the parasites and could be used even in the presence of members of the church. Still, is no one coming? His golems pushed back against the weakened invaders while he worked to restore the walls of his fort. His gaze shifted toward the castle in the distance. On its walls, he saw guards who had collapsed and others who remained standing, held upright only by the influence of the abyssal relics. Their bodies seemed frozen in time, but in reality, a breeze could even knock them over. What was that Duke even thinking? By now, he partially understood the ruse, but one obstacle remained. The massive shield surrounding the castle blocked access from the outside. It was a vast array spread across the entire fortress, one that even he would struggle to disable. To make things worse, it could not be opened from the outside. It was created to prevent entrance once the castle was under siege, with only a few people having the correct spell to shut it down. Perhaps they never realized how the relics truly worked, or is there another reason? He considered the problem, but quickly realized that solving it would do him no good. He did not know how the shield array functioned, and the guards, whom he now dismissed as little more than puppets, knew even less. The Duke was at the heart of the matter, but unless the Duke awoke, the shield would likely remain in place. That left him with a single option, to awaken the soldiers stationed there and hold off the abyssal creatures before they wiped out the slumbering troops. For now, the monster's focus remained on his position, but he knew that would not last. A deep boom cracked from the side. Roland snapped his head toward the western wall just in time to see one of the watchtowers engulfed in fire. The tower's upper levels split apart as the occult runes carved into its surface flared purple, then shattered. For a heartbeat, the flames glowed with radiant gold before twisting into a plume of black smoke. The blast hurled chunks of molten stone into the courtyard below, and Roland froze. That tower had contained one of the relics, and the sight left no doubt that Arthur and his allies had managed to disable it. With one gone, the constant resonance in the air grew fainter. Only 5 relics remained, yet his companions would face greater danger now that the monsters had become fully aware of their movements and power. At a gesture from the witch, a line of monsters broke away and charged toward the burning tower. Several cultists in insect form followed. Roland regretted that he was in no condition to help Arthur directly. At most, he could command a few golems to fire at the monsters that had split away and scatter a handful of runic bombs to slow their advance. The ground shuddered beneath him as the blasts struck. Roland forced the terrain to shift again, raising barriers of earth in an attempt to trap the creatures in layered walls of stone and soil. But the monsters tore through each barrier without pause and pressed their attack. 1 relic was destroyed, 5 remained, and time was slipping away. Rows of siege engines stretched across the hills below Isgard's inner palace walls, their frames bristling with runic plates. Each ballista was a fusion of steel and runic magic, designed to fire bolts that could pierce through reinforced castle walls. Behind them, hundreds of armored men stood in disciplined lines, banners snapping in the winds that swirled around the castle. And yet, for all their preparation, the shimmering dome above the main Valyrian palace refused to break. Again. The Grand Knight Commander roared, his crimson cloak thrashing as another storm of fire and steel tore through the air. Bolts tipped with concentrated rune magic shrieked across the night sky, each one carrying a spell meant to enhance their piercing power. They converged on a single section of the dome, striking the patch directly before the entrance gate. The air warped and split with a deafening crack. The impact was thunderous, as if 100 bolts of lightning had struck the same tree. For a heartbeat, the barrier rippled like a mirror on the verge of breaking. Then the light smoothed it over once more, seamless and whole. A groan spread through the ranks. Some soldiers clutched their ears, others muttered in disappointment. The seasoned knights only tightened their grips on their weapons, though unease gnawed at them as well. Report! The Grand Knight Commander's shout cut through the night air. His form was covered by shiny plate mail, and a figure in robes hurried forward. It was a gaunt woman with silver-threaded braids, gasping for breath before she spoke. "My lord, the spell will take time to prepare." She panted as she answered, and behind her, a circle of mages chanted in unison, their voices weaving together in preparation for the siege-class spell that might topple the barrier. "How long?" "Another hour." The commander's expression hardened. His gaze swept the shimmering dome that mocked every effort of their siege. "1 more hour. Far too long." Inside those walls, chaos raged, and every passing moment meant more lives slipping away. He gripped the hilt of his great sword until his knuckles whitened. "Then hold your focus. We cannot fail here. The Valyrian line will not fall while I yet draw breath." His voice rang out over the gathered host like iron striking an anvil. The troops straightened, their unease lessened, and they returned to their positions with renewed vigor. Yet even as discipline returned, the commander knew the truth. If the barrier held, their army would be nothing more than spectators to the massacre inside. Even if the Valyrian Duke himself poured all his strength into the assault, the ancient ward would not break. Only relentless attacks could eventually wear it down, and even then he doubted the mage's spell would be enough. With a heavy heart, he stood watching, uncertain of what horrors might already be unfolding beyond the dome. Within the confines of the massive barrier, a desperate battle raged. 4 figures stood against a tide of abyssal abominations, each monstrosity rushing forward to protect the relic that was their prize. "We need to hurry. More of them are coming." Arthur's voice rang out as he leapt back, his rapier flashing in the dim light. The blade intercepted a scythe-like appendage from a mantis-shaped horror, sparks flying from the clash. "Do not order me around." Julius snarled from the front, irritation plain in his voice. The elder brother clearly disliked being commanded by his younger brother, but he could not fully dismiss him. Julius's long sword blazed with radiant light as he drove it through the mantis thing's thorax. The creature screeched, its body splitting apart under the force of divine mana, but even as it fell, more surged forward. Arthur grimaced, his rapier tracing crimson lines of aura through the air as he parried and countered. He lacked the raw strength that Julius commanded, and his reserves of mana were far smaller. Yet with every foe that fell before him, he grew stronger. His levels climbed higher, and with them came sharpened instincts and battle experience earned through hard work. Minute by minute, his skill deepened, but the swarm pressing in on them could not be ignored. Azure Firestorm. Behind the brothers, an old man raised his hand and unleashed a torrent of blue flames. His spell roared toward the towering abomination that guarded the relic, its flames melting through the stone as they surged forth. The azure flames consumed the abomination's upper body, stripping away layers of abyssal flesh like molten wax. The relic it guarded pulsed with furious light, only to be swallowed by the haze of fire as well. Everyone recoiled, shielding themselves from the searing heat. Julius raised a golden shield, forming a barrier that wrapped around them. The creature's shrieks echoed for several heartbeats before finally dying out. When silence fell, only ash remained, and the relic's power flickered and went dark. "That is the third. 3 more remain," Arthur said as the shield around him dissolved. No one answered. Their gazes had already turned to the tower's entrance, where a golden aura burned like a beacon. Lady Bernadette was not among them in the chamber. She stood at the battlement instead, holding back the tide of monstrosities that clawed to devour them all. Her great sword blazed with radiant fire, each swing cleaving through twisted flesh. Yet for every abomination that fell, another surged forward, an endless wave of writhing bodies that seemed without end. Bernadette's blade carved another blazing arc, severing a hulking brute in two. The thing fell thrashing, black puss hissing against the stone battlement, only for two smaller horrors to leap over its corpse and slash at her with sharp limbs. She pivoted, boots skidding across the bloody rampart, and met both blows head-on. Her great sword flared, radiant flame cascading in a wide burst that turned the creatures into ash. But even she could feel her strength waning. Sweat gathered on her forehead and dampened her straw-like hair. For every dozen abominations she struck down, new ones appeared to take their place. Her aura was tied to her stamina, and the more her light burned her enemies, the faster exhaustion crept in. Lady Bernadette, fall back inside the tower. We've disabled the relic, there's no need to fight alone. Julius called from within as the group prepared to withdraw. Fortunately, the 6 towers were linked by battlements, and the creatures were too simple-minded to block their escape. Instead, they simply pursued from behind. Bernadette gave no reply. She clicked her heels and vanished in a sudden blur of speed. From the sides, more ghoulish monsters appeared, scrambling up the walls to chase her. Let's go. Indeed, young lord. Julius stood ready to receive her, while Arthur remained silent. The 4 of them leapt through the tower window. The mage drifted down behind the 3 fighters, and once he landed, Julius turned to him. Master Anzanus. I know. Do not rush me. The old mage's brows drew together. He disliked being commanded by the young lords but could do little about it. When they reached the far side of the tower, he began his spell. At his level, the chant was incomprehensible, a torrent of heavy mumbling. Hold! Julius raised his blade in a commanding gesture and signaled for patience. Only when the first monstrosities began clawing their way out of the window did he lower his sword. At that moment, Anzanus hurled a massive sphere of blue fire into the tower, consuming both monsters and stone until the structure collapsed in flames. The tower crumbled like a dying torch, the azure blaze devouring its structure in moments. Chunks of molten stone rained into the courtyard, crushing cultist creatures who had rushed forward to defend the relic. The explosion reverberated across the palace grounds, alerting all to their position. We need to move further. Only 3 more remain. Julius spoke again, and the 2 nodded. Only Arthur glanced to the sides. The battlements were not entirely empty. Some soldiers still lay there, unconscious. For the moment, the monsters were focused elsewhere, which allowed the soldiers to be propped against the walls and kept out of the way. Even so, some had already been trampled. What are you doing? Julius glanced back at Arthur, who was tending to 2 soldiers. He was placing them against a wall he believed the cultists would not pass through, though his older brother seemed to disagree. Just give me a moment. After shaking his head in disapproval, the elder Valerian moved toward the next tower while the mage hesitated. Bernadette pressed ahead without pause, clearing the way for their approach. Then, without warning, a shriek rang out from above. Arthur was caught off guard as he tended to one of the sleeping soldiers. He looked up just in time to see a cultist wrapped in a mantle of azure flames plummeting straight toward him. He shoved the soldier aside to help him out of harm's way, but the movement left him exposed. The cultist descended like a blazing comet, claws stretched wide, fire trailing in its wake. Arthur raised his rapier too late. The talons were already upon him. Arthur! Julius's voice cut through the chaos as a radiant blur streaked along the battlement. His long sword tore through the cultist in mid-descent, splitting its burning form in 2. The flames howled as they burst apart in a shower of embers, the body collapsing to ash at Arthur's feet. For a moment, silence held between the brothers. Arthur's chest heaved, his rapier still lifted, though no foe remained. Julius stood above him, sword lowered, his golden aura burning bright. The younger brother met the elder's eyes. No words passed between them, only a silent nod that spoke of trust and approval. Julius extended his hand and Arthur took it without hesitation. With one firm pull, Julius lifted him up and said, "Stay sharp, brother." The words were quiet, almost uncertain, as if he feared they might not be welcome. Arthur smirked faintly and brushed the ash from his sleeve. "You too, brother Julius. We must go, young lords. There is no time." The mage broke the moment, waving his hand while chanting softly. A glow spread across the ground and settled over the sleeping soldier. "This ward will hide them from detection. Now we have to move." agreed. Julius nodded, and he and Arthur pressed forward. Ahead, Bernadette's great sword roared to life once more, cutting down their next opponent. Several cult members emerged, far stronger than the lesser creatures they had faced before. Yet Arthur and the others did not falter. They tightened their grip on their weapons and welcomed the coming clash. They managed to get the third one. But at this pace, Roland's thoughts intensified as his display showed the disappearance of yet another relic. Only 3 remained, and time was slipping away. At this point, he was encased in a barrier of earth and hardened rock. The witch's minions had surrounded his position, leaving no escape. Outside, his floating golems relayed live footage of the battlefield, and the situation looked grim for his allies. One swarm of ghoulish creatures was pursuing Arthur and his party. They had managed to stay ahead for now, but several Tier 3 cultists had appeared to block their path. Their progress would soon be halted, and the siege would drag on. The group that had retreated into the inner part of the Great Hall with the Duke was, surprisingly, left unscathed. The witch seemed to ignore them as if they were not worth targeting, which meant that more of her monsters were now focused on him while the others remained safe inside. For a moment, he wondered if he should have hidden away in the inner palace as well and simply waited it out, but there was no telling how long they would have lasted in there. To make matters worse, his potential allies were dying. He had planned to remove the relics and awaken the guards sealed within the palace. Yet many of those guards had already fallen. The horde of cultist creatures had trampled them while they were still trapped in illusions, and some had even been devoured before they could fight back. Even if his plan succeeded, the army he needed might no longer exist. That left him with another option, dismantling the dome that enclosed them. At first, the idea seemed impossible, since the barrier was designed to resist even Tier 4 class holders and prolonged sieges. But not all hope was lost, because an opportunity had revealed itself. The hovering drones were not only relaying footage of the monsters. They were also analyzing the environment. Through this, Roland discovered something important. Someone outside was attempting to break in. A steady bombardment had been pounding the barrier for some time, perhaps from the moment the shield had been hijacked. He could see that one section of the shield was being targeted. The attackers had not yet broken through, but their efforts created a chance for him to help. From inside, the shield's structure was weaker, since it had not been designed to withstand allied fire. Any force applied from within would cause far more damage than strikes from outside. But by my calculations, even my strongest spell would not break through, unless I time it correctly. Roland frowned. The process would be complicated. The bombardment outside followed a somewhat consistent rhythm, though the intensity of each strike varied. He could not be certain that their efforts would synchronize with his, but there was hope. He knew the standard procedures for breaking barriers, and he suspected the attackers would eventually employ siege magic. A more devastating spell that would cause a massive amount of damage in an instant. This is quite the predicament. The walls around him were breaking apart as the horde pounded them without pause. Several of his golems had already been buried beneath the sand while others lay scattered outside. His focus remained on defense, yet he knew he could not endure much longer. There was one option that might aid him, but with 2 Solarian paladins still active beyond the barrier, it was far from simple. He ran the numbers, but the outcome was grim. He would need to survive at least 30 minutes before his window of attack arrived. Even then, he could not be certain the plan would succeed. Holding out for half an hour seemed nearly impossible, as monsters were already crawling through the cracks of his protective dome, which trembled on the verge of collapse. For a fleeting moment, he questioned how he had ended up in such a situation at all. If he had wanted to escape, there had been ways. He wondered when the change had come, when he had become too sentimental to leave the others behind. At this point, he could not even imagine abandoning Arthur. With that conviction, he steadied himself. As the first hideous face forced its way inside, he drove his fist forward with a blow powerful enough to shatter the ground beneath him. Roland's fist struck the earth, and the ground beneath him glowed with a deep orange light. The monsters rushed to overwhelm him, but before they could reach him, a shockwave burst outward and tore everything apart. Walls of hardened rock splintered and turned into projectiles, ripping through the massive sphere of cult monsters and scattering their bodies aside. When the dust finally settled, Roland emerged. His armor sizzled, and parts of his body were visible beneath the scorched metal. "You'll have to try better than that to kill me." Roland tasted dust as part of his faceplate came loose for a moment. The blast he had unleashed tore through a large number of the attackers, but it was a double-edged sword. His armor was already repairing itself, and now that he was outside, he could also restore his golems. Mechanical spider limbs twitched, and broken fragments pulled together around him as he activated his skill again. With his higher level, this style of combat had become easier, though it still carried a strict time limit. The more he restored his troops, the faster they deteriorated and the less useful they became. You shall not succeed. You are only wasting time. We will see about that. The monstrous witch pointed with her crooked finger, driving her minions toward him. Things looked grim, yet he could hear it in her voice. Beneath her facade was concern. She kept glancing toward the other towers, clearly unsure whether they could endure long enough for her to complete her mission. Young lord, is this wise? Be silent and tend to my father. A man with blue hair gave the order to an armored guard. Around them, several people were being carried, not by human hands but by beings of pure water energy. These spirits moved in perfect unison, reshaping themselves into cradles and supports beneath those affected by the occult relics. The great hall shimmered with an aquatic glow as the spirits carried everyone toward the wide doors at the far end. The massive gates stood partly open, and beyond them a towering man carried another draped over his shoulder. He showed no interest in the others being rescued and continued deeper inside, intent on protecting himself and the man he bore. You will answer for this, brother. All of this is your fault. An aquatic spirit halted before two figures. One was Ivan Valerian, who would surely be blamed for the disaster. His brother Tybalt gestured sharply, ordering the spirit to carry Ivan to safety, along with their spiteful mother. He felt no affection for either of them, yet he couldn't allow them to die here without taking the blame. My lord, an enemy. The guard's warning rang out as a creature emerged in the distance. Tybalt knew the cultists had ignored them for some time, ignoring the ones inside the illusion. Yet he also knew that could not last. He had been guiding people to safety long enough that it was inevitable they would eventually be targeted. He thrust out his hand, lips moving with incredible speed. Dozens of spheres of water appeared above his head, swirling together and compressing with violent force before bursting into streams of razor-sharp projectiles. The monster's flesh split under the barrage, forcing it to retreat, but more soon emerged to take its place. That will do. You should retreat as well. The voice echoed from above, and Tybalt's brow furrowed in indignation. I will not forget this disgrace. The people you saved today will remember your deeds, my lord, and repay you in time. The fourth brother made a sweeping gesture toward the great construct hovering in the air. He had planned only to save his mother and a few members of the court, but the flying golem had forced his hand. Now his efforts extended even to Ivan, whose folly had begun this strange calamity. Nevertheless, the man to whom the golemic construct belonged could render the bracelets useless at any moment. For now, he knew he had no choice but to follow his orders. The man had promised him potential rewards from a prominent institute within the royalist faction's lands, an offer that was difficult to refuse. Even so, he could not suppress the indignation he felt at the way he was treated. As a potential candidate for a dukedom, taking orders from those beneath him filled him with deep discomfort. Suit integrity at risk. Warning. Critical damage to leg joints detected. Red alerts flashed across his HUD before vanishing as he dismissed them. His focus returned to the monsters charging toward him. Dozens of abominations filled the courtyard, some barely reaching his chest, others grotesquely fused into multi-limbed horrors, with several even reaching Tier 3 status. The devices meant to prevent their fusion were overwhelmed by sheer numbers, and some of the remaining abyssal cultists were twisting the process further. They fused the creatures with their insect forms for a temporary surge of strength, hurling themselves at him in a frenzy. Their shrieks mingled with the sound of golems shattering and flesh being torn apart. Time and again, he restored his creations, only for them to be destroyed once more. Stationed at the center of the courtyard, he was surrounded, and the temporary fortress he had raised with earth magic was crumbling. Worse still, the horde seemed endless, growing larger with each passing moment. He cast a glance toward the watchtowers. Arthur's progress had stalled, and despite defending for more than 10 minutes, they had yet to push beyond the fourth tower. At least Tybalt managed to get the other nobles in. At this moment, the massive doors leading into the inner palace were under siege by a horde of abyssal creatures. The attack showed no signs of slowing, and the courtyard was crawling with monstrosities. Even so, most of the horde and its leader, the strange witch, were focused on him. The witch lingered at a distance, watching and waiting, as if certain that no outside aid could reach them. Roland kept wondering what those beyond the palace walls intended. If this was meant to be a trap, it had already failed. The only explanation was that they did not understand how the relics functioned or how to disable them. He had once helped the church with that task, but the knowledge had clearly not spread. For now, he could only rely on himself. Yet his plan required outside support, because there was no way he could face this horde alone. Ugh! A grunt escaped his mouth as he looked down. A sharp appendage had pierced through his armor and sunk deep into his thigh. Instantly, he yanked out the writhing limb and cast a focused divine spell to prevent the wound from being poisoned or cursed. Even though he had been using divine attacks, the monsters showed no signs of slowing. Divine mana was usually a direct counter to undead creatures, but these were different. The energy burned away the small worms that nested in people's heads, yet these monsters carried some kind of built-in protection. Even if he cast several holy aligned spells, the results would be disappointing, and to make matters worse, his main enemy was still watching. Why do you resist? Soon you will join us in the everlasting dream with our Lord. Just let it happen. The witch no longer looked the same. She had fused with several of her minions. Her legs were rooted in the ground, and she no longer moved. She had become a grotesque hub, linking monsters and cultists together. Their movements grew more coordinated, and they stopped charging from only one direction. Slowly, the entire palace was being overtaken, and if he did not act soon, Arthur and the others would be overwhelmed. Their mission to destroy the relics would fail. It is too early to go all out, but I have no choice. At least she had lost some reasoning and is still targeting me, can't let this chance slip. The opponent he faced was clearly not acting with much strategy. If it had been him, he would have focused on the smaller group trying to reach the relics rather than on the obvious distraction he was creating. Fortunately, the witch was blinded by her rage and kept her attention fixed on him. Unfortunately, that also placed him in grave danger. If he could not hold out and fell, his allies would be the next to be targeted. He knew this fight would become a battle of endurance, though he had no idea how long he could hold. His aura shifted, a reddish energy spreading around his body before blending with a bluish tint to form a deep violet hue. His power surged outward, and the nearby golems were invigorated. The battle soon became a grueling slog. With maces in hand, he swung again and again, each strike launching multiple monsters into the air with sheer force. The pressure of his swings created bursts of wind, and his armored plates deflected most incoming attacks. Some creatures warped into twisted fusions of flesh, spewing bones and corrosive projectiles at him. Layers of mana shields and protective mantles absorbed much of the damage, but not all. Bit by bit, his body took the punishment. The swarm closed in from every direction, and his weapons began to falter. The golems he had been using to communicate with his allies, along with the ones relaying images from above, were called down to fight at his side. Even they were needed now, unleashing volleys of mana bolts and projectiles upon the enemy. The battle grew more grotesque by the moment, yet he pressed on. Whenever his mana ran low, he drew on potion casings hidden within his armor, but soon his strength began to waver. The aura around his body dimmed, and the purple glow faded. He tried to raise the earth to shelter himself behind rocky walls, but the enemies had already entrenched themselves. Relentless, gory projectiles slowly whittled down his defenses and pushed him back. His legs were pierced by multiple sharp bones and wrapped in robes of tentacle flesh. Half his face was exposed, revealing part of his mouth and one eye to the air. 3 of the 4 robotic arms that held his shields together had been torn out, only one remained. As he barely held himself upright, the witch's laughter rang across the battlefield. You fight so hard for a world that has already abandoned you. Roland flinched at the gloat. The abominations around him paused, their tentacles coiling tighter around his lower limbs and midsection. It sounded like a villainous monologue from someone certain of victory. Your allies will not succeed. Once I am done with you, all of them will dream the eternal dream. Roland's head dipped for a moment. His body was battered, his armor splintered, the violet aura gone, and his mana reserves below 10%. The monsters circled, waiting to finish him off, but instead of a frown, a smile crossed his face. Did you know the difference between runic and ordinary spatial items? Hey! The witch frowned in confusion. She had expected begging or a plea for mercy, not a lecture about something unrelated. Let me explain, runic spatial coordinates are simply markers that lead to a specific spatial space. You can imagine it as an area floating in space. If you know them, you can open that space again, even if you lost the original rune that pointed to it. What are you babbling about? Have you gone insane? The witch snapped and ordered for her minions to tighten the bindings and fire at him again, but Roland kept speaking. Under normal circumstances, changing a spatial rune on an item is considered impossible. A person must not only master rune magic but also runesmithing. He raised his only free hand. In it, a shattered longsword caught the moonlight. It was the weapon he had swapped for his maces, and even it had broken in the fight. It takes time, and shifting runes during combat is tedious, but not, he said, pausing as he looked at the broken blade. Then, before the witch could react, he drove the sword into his exposed stomach. Impossible. Are you tired of living? The witch sneered, confused by the self-injury. Roland did not seem to care about her reaction. He glanced at his status screen. The stab had dropped his health below 25%, and a strange warmth began to gather in his chest. I hate testing new skills like this. He focused inward as he felt the skill begin to activate. Overlord's indomitable will was starting, and though he hated relying on untested abilities, he had no other choice. The warmth in his chest expanded. His body straightened as the shackles of flesh and bone pinning him down were torn apart by sheer force. The sword lodged in his stomach was pushed out as the wound closed within seconds. Overlord's indomitable will has been activated. His vitality surged back. Muscles expanded slightly as every injury healed, and the mana he had poured out during the fight returned to him. His body was once again wrapped in a reddish glow as Overlord's might reset instantly. Mana overflow remained unusable for now, yet he could feel his resilience growing. His body hardened against the damage still raining down on him. Nothing but a last desperate effort. You do not deserve to be part of the dream. Die. The monsters swarmed toward him. The witch, twisted into a malignant shape, shrieked as a mass of tentacles and projectiles erupted in his direction. But this transformation was not yet finished. There was a reason he had spoken in a monologue as well. Before the attacks could reach him, he shed his armor, helmet included, and leapt into the air. Only the chest plate remained, the sole piece that had endured the entire ordeal. Runes flared to life, glowing and shifting as his restored mana completed the spatial structure. Once it stabilized, he summoned another suit of armor, one he had hidden in a separate spatial pocket. The transformation began as it had many times before. The chest plate of his discarded armor fell away, replaced by crimson scales that spread across his body. The monsters surged forward, some sprouting wings in desperation to reach him. Before they could close the distance, a massive sphere of crimson fire erupted and engulfed the battlefield. The nearest creatures were reduced to ash in an instant, while those farther out were scorched, writhing and twisting in agony as they collapsed to the ground. With his mana restored and a brand new suit of armor, he stepped out from within the sphere. Fire surged across the battlefield, consuming everything that dared to come too close. Roland let out a sigh of relief as he confirmed that all his limbs were intact. His armor was fresh, and like the one before, it contained its own spatial storage filled with supplies. Within moments, more floating golems appeared to replace the ones that had fallen. For a brief instant, it seemed as though the situation was under control. Sir Wayland, we have secured the fifth relic, but I am not certain we can reach the last one. Arthur's voice rang in his helmet before he could decide on his next move. 5 relics were already gone, and only one remained. To complicate matters, their allies' counterattack was fast approaching. If there was ever a time to strike at the barrier, it was now, and he would go through the tower to achieve that. Leave the final tower to me. Just support me if you are able. With that command, he turned toward the looming structure. His chest plate parted to reveal a glowing orb encircled by intricate runes. From within the hidden storage, elongated floating devices emerged. Painted crimson, they arranged themselves into a ring aimed directly at the tower. You! I will not allow this. The witch's voice cut through the chaos as she commanded her remaining monsters and cultists to swarm Roland. Suspended above them, he unleashed a crimson blaze from the core in his chest. The fire stretched outward, guided by the strange floating devices shaped like hexagonal prisms with wide bases that narrowed at the top. The torrent of crimson fire burst outward, starting small but quickly growing in power. The hovering prisms fed the blaze, turning what began as a concentrated burst into a wild spinning torrent of flames. For an instant, the entire courtyard was bathed in blinding red light, as though the sun itself was rising. The tower screamed in protest as the cultists' barrier around it trembled. It took less than a second for cracks to form before the defensive magic collapsed. Stop him! Stop him now! The witch's shriek split the air as monsters hurled themselves at him in a frenzy. She gathered her own magic and released a wave of corrosive energy, but it was all for nothing. His crimson flame shield held firm, infused with holy power that purified much of the abyssal assault. The tower groaned louder, the sound like bones snapping under strain. Crimson fire coiled and writhed across its surface before bursting through the center and incinerating the cultists within. Yet the surge did not end there. The fire pressed forward and collided with the vast dome-shaped barrier that kept them trapped inside. I cannot hold this for long. Roland poured the last of his mana and every ounce of strength into the blast. The fire spun like a drill as it tore at the defensive barrier. Seconds dragged by, but the defenses held. A strike from the outside rattled the dome and made it shudder, but even that was not enough to pierce it. Damn it, was it still not enough? His mana reserves were dropping. Too much mana had been spent holding back the monsters, and the barrier around the watchtower had endured far longer than he had anticipated. He had miscalculated in the chaos of battle, and his reinforcements would not be breaking through. Just as despair began to take hold, another force slammed into the barrier from the left side. Flames again, but this time burning with a brilliant blue light. What power! I must uncover his secrets. An old mage watched as a massive surge of fire energy struck a watchtower. His group had already forced their way through 5 others, but this one was their limit. Most of his companions were barely clinging to life, while he alone still held some strength. They had shielded him so he could cast his spells, but the situation now looked dire. Is he trying to? The tower burst into flames, yet the firestorm did not end there. It surged onward, hammering the massive mana shield that protected them. Anzanuz alone could sense the subtle fluctuations in the flow of mana. He realized that the strike had been aimed at a precise point for a reason. He frowned, analyzing the situation. With the towers destroyed and the relics disabled, the guards bound by the enchantments would soon awaken. Unfortunately, many of their allies had already been devoured by the monstrous cult entities, and the survivors would likely be disoriented. If they were to stand any chance, they needed every possible ally. Master Anzanuz, what are you doing? Helping your friend. Please look after this old man afterwards. I doubt my body will last much longer. Though uninjured, his stamina was nearly gone. Only a single mana potion remained, enough to restore a fraction of his energy before he began casting. Young Lord Arthur saw his intent and gave a solemn nod. Azure flames swirled around him, erupting into a firestorm that surged into the crimson blaze, fusing the two into a greater torrent. Yet even combined, the force was not enough. The barrier still held firm. Lady Bernadette, we must aid them. Julius shouted from behind the Solarian paladin. The woman answered with a nod and raised her sword high. Golden light gathered around the blade, intensifying as the oldest Valyrian sibling placed both hands upon her shoulders to strengthen her. Arthur stood back, observing. He recognized that Julius and Bernadette were performing a combination technique, though he regretfully did not know how to help them. Still, he activated every skill he could muster and raised one of his rapiers. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, weakened by the injuries he had sustained. Bernadette thrust her sword forward, unleashing a torrent of divine aura. The blast spread as wide as her blade, and beside it flared a thinner crimson ray, born from Arthur's desperate strike. Together, their attacks converged on a single point of the barrier, and at last it began to give way. The barrier's surface rippled like a pond struck by stones. Cracks spider-webbed outward from the impact point, but instead of shattering, the dome resisted, bending inward and refusing to shatter. Almost there, just a little more. Roland's head burned as every rune on his armor shone under the strain of various rune-empowering skills like rune overload. He poured every ounce of strength into his spell, struggling to push the barrier past its limits. The dome buckled and bulged beneath the ceaseless surge of power. His allies joined in, and for a moment it seemed they might break through. However, the defenses soon roared back to life. No, is this some kind of hidden safeguard? The dome's surface shivered with new energy. Cracks had already formed, yet the shield drew on a massive surge of mana. Its construction was far more sophisticated than Roland had anticipated. Energy from untouched sections of the barrier shifted to the point of impact, reinforcing the weak spot just as it was about to give way. No, this. He gritted his teeth and forced more power into the spell. Switching targets was useless, for the shield would only redirect its strength again. Even with Arthur's aid, it was hopeless. Just as despair began to take hold, something impossible occurred. What? Roland froze as the impenetrable barrier split open. It did not yield where he had struck from within. Instead, it burst apart from the outside. The impossible had happened. The barrier, which had seemed eternal, did not break under Roland's desperate assault, nor under the combined strikes of his allies, but from beyond. A perfectly straight horizontal line appeared, glowing white-hot as if scorched by some unseen force. It looked like a great wound in the barrier, and through it, the outside world came into view. Noise erupted instantly, a wave of shouts and cries carried through the gap. Torches blazed in the darkness, revealing thousands gathered beyond, an army flying the Valyrian banner. But the tear was small, and worse still, it was already closing. Before Roland's exhausted eyes, the wound shuddered and began to mend. Threads of condensed mana crawled across the gap, weaving the barrier whole again. The relief he had prayed for had not arrived, nor had the army he so desperately needed. At least I managed to disable the relics, that has to count for something. He threw himself forward, trying to keep the tear from sealing shut, but monstrous tentacles as thick as trees lashed out at him. The witch stood there, her body twisted into a grotesque form, more like the abomination he had faced at his wedding than the spider she once resembled. Things were going badly. His companions were spent, their potions gone. The soldiers were only just waking, and even if they joined the fight, Roland doubted they could hold against the endless tide of monsters. Even if they were victorious, it would demand many lives. Then, out of nowhere, his HUD flickered for an instant as he dodged another strike and vaulted onto a higher wall, putting some distance between himself and the witch he struggled to contain. Wait, who is that? The tear in the barrier had shrunk to almost nothing, yet someone had slipped through. A lone figure stood inside, unnoticed until now. On the scorched stones of the last watchtower, he remained. He was old, his silver hair catching the firelight, his neat white mustache gleaming. Light armor, elegant yet practical, fit his lean frame. In his hand, he carried a long, slender fencing blade. The weapon shone as if polished that very morning, its length covered in intricate runes, symbols so complex that even Roland struggled to understand them. Roland blinked, stunned. The pressure radiating from the man was staggering. Even the witch, who had seemed ready to die for her cause, fell silent. The instant she noticed him, the last remnants of her human self recoiled in fear. No, it's impossible. How can you be here? The man was well known, even appearing at the earlier celebration, or at least someone who looked like him had. Roland had long suspected that the figure in the palace had not been the Duke himself but a body double. Now he felt a sinking certainty about what the noble had intended for the cultists, and why his scheme had collapsed so disastrously. Silence hung over the battlefield, broken only by the groans of soldiers and guards as they began to wake. The Duke gave no reply. He simply scanned the courtyard, taking in the destruction that surrounded them. For a moment, his gaze fell on Arthur and his companions, but soon it settled on Roland's armored figure. Why is he just staring? If you believe you have won, think again. The everlasting dream will not end. It begins tonight. As Roland endured the Duke's silent survey, the cultist leader cried out. In an instant, the remaining monsters rushed toward her. Their bodies convulsed, burst apart, and then fused into her flesh, reshaping her into something even more grotesque and powerful. This is... The energy rippling from her was not identical, yet disturbingly similar to what he had felt when he was attacked by the cultists. The witch was merging with the monsters, forging a stronger, twisted form, an abomination on the level of a Tier 4 threat. Your Grace, we must stop her. She is trying to ascend into an eldritch horror. His voice carried across the courtyard, infused with mana. He knew the name well. It was one of those creatures that had severed Bernir's arm and nearly killed them all. If not for the intervention of the Solarian Church, he would already be dead. The Duke himself was a Tier 4 class holder, yet even so, Roland doubted how he would fare against this woman. She was far stronger than the cultists they had faced before. The thing she was becoming was no mere imitation of power but a true horror. Why isn't he doing anything? Even as Roland's warning rang out, the Duke did not move. He only watched as the witch's transformation unfolded. The eldritch horror he had seen before had been a writhing mass of tentacles, but this one was taking a different, more terrifying form. Yet, he would not just let it turn, he still had some spare power left. As many times before, rapid machine reassembly was activated again. The shapes that guided his previous spell were restored along with his armor. This time, they rose into the air and arranged themselves into a circle. From within that circle, a massive surge of fire energy appeared. It swelled quickly, growing from the size of a golf ball to that of a boulder, and it kept expanding. The soldiers who had just awakened were stunned. They saw something like a miniature sun forming above them while beneath it a grotesque mass of flesh and bone writhed, struggling to take shape. Roland gritted his teeth. The fire sphere burned hotter as it continued to expand overhead. He clenched his gauntlet fist, and the miniature sun compressed inward, the air around it warping as gravity and flame fused into one overwhelming force. The abomination that had once been the witch shrieked. 100 mouths screamed across its body as misaligned appendages burst from its twisted form. The air soured with whispers that clawed at the mind. Soldiers clutched their heads and some collapsed, but Roland did not falter. The miniature sun plummeted like a meteor, tearing the air apart with its descent. When it struck the swarm around the witch, the explosion turned night into day. Smaller monsters vanished instantly, their bodies reduced to drifting ash before they could even cry out. The earth itself shattered, scorched stone liquefying beneath the spell's heat. The witch's body shielded itself almost automatically, forming walls of fused flesh, but Roland had never intended her to be the target. He knew he could not stop the transformation or defeat the monster with his current strength. Instead, he concentrated on erasing the weaker creatures that swarmed around her, burning away those that would raise her power even further. Perhaps the Duke did not care if this monstrosity grew stronger, but Roland would do whatever it took to tip the scales in their favor. Once the force had settled, little remained in the courtyard. The holes the monsters had been crawling through began to collapse, and it seemed that no more of them were waiting below. The witch was still present, however, her body was now sealed inside a strange pulsating cocoon that looked close to tearing open. Roland seized this moment to escape and landed beside Arthur and his allies. "Sir Wayland, are you all right?" "For now, but what about you? Your arm looks broken." "It's fine, don't worry about it." He wanted to ask Arthur about the Duke's intentions, but knew his friend would not have an answer. The Duke was not known for dealing with his family often, and even Julius seemed stunned by the events unfolding. Soon their attention turned toward the ball of flesh in the distance. It rippled apart and released a blast of occult energy that caused almost every soldier nearby to collapse once more. "Evil energy, gather around me!" shouted Julius as he activated his shield. A faint dome of radiant light formed around him, and the others rushed close. It lessened the force of the abyssal magic, but even so, Arthur struggled to remain standing. "By the ancestral wizards, what is that?" Anzanuza's hand shook as he pointed at the monstrosity coming out of the ball of flesh. The cocoon tore apart with a sickening crack, like bone splitting under too much weight. What emerged from within made even the veterans among the soldiers fall silent and their bodies to tremble. The witch's new form stepped into the ruined courtyard, a fully realized horror, its body similar to an arachne. Her skin was a throbbing mix of red and purple, shiny with a strange glow. Jagged bone wings with torn membranes stretched out, blocking the moonlight. Countless unblinking eyes sprouted from her spider-like body, shifting around, while mouths with grinding teeth appeared, hungry for life. Tentacles squirmed across her, some with claws, others with barbs dripping corrosive liquid. Every step she took made the ground shiver, as if the world itself rejected her presence. The whispers grew stronger. They slithered into the minds of those nearby, hollow promises, laughter, screams. Some soldiers convulsed and bled from their ears, others turned their weapons on themselves, unable to endure the psychic assault. Roland staggered for a moment as even the barrier of holy light was not enough to stop the attack. Arthur was pale, yet he managed to prop himself up with his rapier. Julius gritted his teeth while his shield of light flickered under the crushing aura. Bernadette whispered prayers through clenched teeth, her blade glowing faintly in defiance. Even Anzanus, though trembling, forced his old hands to weave a spell that produced a shield to protect them. This was not the same as the relic. It was a direct attack from the monstrosity before them. The creature radiated an aura of terror. Anyone below Tier 3 lost their mind completely, while those at that level could barely keep hold of their sanity. Yet there was one person who remained unaffected, and that person now stood directly in front of the monstrosity. The Duke did not flinch. While others shielded their eyes or clutched at their heads, he stood calmly before the transformed witch, his blade lowered at his side, its runes glowing faintly, prepared to be used. The whispers that sought to crawl into every soldier's skull broke harmlessly against him, as though the abyss itself dared not trespass too far into his mind. Is he finally starting to move? Roland watched as he assembled his own barrier, easing the strain around the group. The floating golems that had survived the surge of occult energies, along with the ones he had restored, moved outward and formed shields around the weakened soldiers to keep them alive. He could no longer contribute to the fight itself, but at least he could still save lives. The Duke, however, seemed to focus only on the being before him, indifferent to what was happening to his subjects or even to his own sons. The Duke took a single step forward. The sound of his boot striking stone was faint in the courtyard, yet it felt as though time itself had stopped. The abomination froze mid-step, hundreds of eyes locking on him. Even the whispers ceased. For the first time since her transformation began, the witch hesitated. "Enough," the Duke said. His voice was quiet, but in the moment of silence, everyone heard it clearly. The monstrosity screamed, its 100 mouths spewing words of hatred. Each one seemed to carry its own will, and together the sound became incomprehensible. The earth cracked, and dust spread as the towering creature moved. It was nearly 20 meters in height, making the Duke appear no larger than an ant. Yet from Roland's perspective, the mustached man seemed to tower over it. The Duke drew his weapon slowly, revealing a thin fencer's blade. Compared to the hulking monstrosity, it looked like nothing more than a needle, far too small to cause any harm. The creature hesitated, then struck first. Its countless eyes fixed on the Duke as a surge of mana gathered in the air. A massive ball of occult energy formed before the Arachne. Her humanoid hands, tipped with sharp nails, cradled the growing spell. "Should we move?" Arthur asked, standing with Roland directly in the path of the forming spell. "That would probably be a good idea." Before they could react, the monster jerked forward and unleashed a ray of unholy, corrosive energy at the Duke. He did not flinch. One hand remained behind his back as he raised his weapon. His movement was neither fast nor was it slow. He thrust the blade into the oncoming attack, and in that instant, everything turned white. Roland and the others fled to the sides in horror as the wave of malevolent energies surged toward them. The scale was immense, and most of them were already exhausted. Any magical shields would have been useless, but just as the blast was about to strike, a strange flash of white filled the area and was followed by a resonant sound. The explosion should have swallowed everyone whole. It should have erased the Duke from existence, body and soul. Instead, white light poured from his rapier and split the monstrous ray cleanly in two. What had seemed like an unstoppable tide of annihilation became two rivers of energy that parted around him and curved upward to avoid the castle behind. The force struck the protective barrier instead, causing it to ripple violently. Everyone froze, staring at the Duke as his aura burst to life. It was still aura energy, yet its coloring was different. For most, it was crimson, but here it shone silvery white. For a moment, all eyes were fixed on the miasma clearing and the Duke standing tall with his weapon raised. Then a massive wail erupted from the transformed witch. The monster reeled back, her countless eyes wide with disbelief. A circular wound opened across her torso, burning with the Duke's advanced white aura. It was not a wound caused by a physical strike but by the overwhelming surge of energy and the shockwave that followed. Her flesh boiled away while her wings were torn apart by the torrent. Yet she did not fall. Her body screamed as it knit itself back together, spawning endless tendrils and vomiting clouds of poisonous vapor. Tentacles lashed at the Duke faster than ballista bolts, but each one crumbled to ash as it collided with his sword aura. Poison spread through the courtyard like a storm, but it evaporated against the white flames that spread around him and created a strange shimmering phenomenon. "I have to record this." He forced himself to focus while the malignant blast fizzled out against the shield. Most of his golems had been destroyed, though he could still restore a few. At his command, they rose into the air and kept their distance. Using his senses and enchanted armor, Roland detected something unsettling about the two Tier 4 beings locked in combat. He had dealt with the headmistress and had crossed paths with the witch in the swamps, but this was his first time witnessing a true battle between entities of such power. There is a distortion around their bodies, as if each one carries its own region of warped reality. His display revealed a strange phenomenon, a pair of circular energy zones surrounding the two combatants. They differed in size and density, yet both collided again and again, with the Duke steadily overwhelming the one generated by the malformed creature. It was valuable data, but difficult to gather. Before long, another blast of abyssal energy rippled outward in all directions, disrupting his golem's recording devices and forcing many of the soldiers nearby to groan in pain. The battle was far from finished, and Roland realized it might be wiser to think first of his own safety and of Arthur's. "Lord Arthur, we need to get down from this wall before it collapses." "Agreed." Arthur was not alone, for his brother Julius, still clutching his shield, stumbled closer. Bernadette helped steady him, but her golden aura had completely vanished. The wall beneath them groaned as cracks spread through the stone. Dust rained down, and the shrieks of the monstrosity drowned out nearly every other sound. Anzanus, the mage, staggered forward. His old body had reached its limit, and he had exhausted all his mana. Just as he was about to collapse, a magical force lifted him up and carried him forward. Ah, this is embarrassing. You had better keep your promise, and you must never mention this to anyone. Don't worry, I'm sure the headmistress will be willing to share her knowledge. The old man found himself slung over Roland's shoulder, drawn in by the mage hand spell. With the Duke fighting the monster, the suppressing hold she held over the soldiers weakened, allowing them to move on their own. One by one, they abandoned the crumbling wall. The courtyard was no longer a battlefield. It had become an apocalypse contained within crumbling stone walls. The air bent and screamed under the pressure of colliding powers. The Duke advanced in flawless rhythm, each thrust of his fencing blade carrying that strange silvery aura. His strikes appeared ordinary to the naked eye, yet every one of them unleashed a shockwave that tore the abyssal cultist's body apart. The witch shrieked with all her mouths. Tentacles rained down like spears, each one dripping venom that hissed as it touched the air. None of them reached him. The white flames surrounding his body shielded him from their corrosive effects, and his speed defied belief. His form shifted constantly. Whenever a tentacle seemed certain to pierce him, his body vanished, leaving only an afterimage that burned with white fire. Roland's display flickered again, struggling to process what it was witnessing. The distortion around the combatants blurred the sensors, which failed to track the Duke's rapid movements. To the runic HUD, it seemed as though he were teleporting across the battlefield. His presence dominated the entire field, and his opponent appeared powerless, as if he were merely toying with the witch. Unbelievable. Those tentacles lose part of their strength once they enter the Duke's field of influence. It is as though the very laws that empower them are being crushed and rewritten. Is this what a battle between Tier 4s looks like? It was quite fascinating to behold this high-speed battle, even though it was one-sided. The Abyssal Witch survived only through her extraordinary regenerative powers, but even those were failing. With every passing second, her body diminished. The tentacles that composed her form dissolved into dust as the Duke's aura consumed them. The abomination's scream rose higher, splitting the night air and shattering glass. Hundreds of voices shrieked in unison, words layered over one another in maddening tongues, each a call to despair. Yet the Duke moved forward, unshaken. His fencer's blade traced a straight line, glimmering with silvery white light. With each thrust, the abomination's colossal body convulsed, holes opening faster than her regeneration could mend. Disappointing. The Duke finally spoke before the monster. The witch spat venom and exhaled black mist that should have corroded stone and flesh alike, but it curled and burned away against the Duke's aura, unable to harm him. Tentacles shot up from the ground beneath him, sharp as spears, yet they pierced only air as he vanished before they could strike. Pathetic creature. And no, the dream must begin. I was chosen by the Great Lord. I cannot fail. By now, the witch's form had diminished greatly. Once towering at 20 meters, she had shrunk to only 5. Each time her body was seared by the flames, her size dwindled further, and it was clear the Duke was about to end it all. Roland stopped in his tracks. His group had descended from the broken walls and now gathered below. Soldiers and even servants who had awoken stood in awe of the man with the fencing blade. Throughout the battle, his left arm had remained fixed behind his back, and his posture stood tall like an unbreakable pillar. The Duke moved again. His rapier flickered forward. A single thrust, almost casual, as though he were dueling an apprentice. But in that moment, something impossible unfolded. The silver-white aura coating his weapon did not stop at the blade's tip. It surged outward, splitting into thousands of spectral lines of light, each one a phantom thrust carrying the will of his strike. Every line of aura struck the abomination simultaneously. The horror's flesh rippled as if pierced by 1,000 invisible lances. Holes erupted across her twisted frame faster than her regenerative powers could respond. Each thrust carried not only piercing power but also his authority that denied the witch's existence. The monstrosity's many mouths shrieked again, but this time the sound no longer affected the nearby soldiers. Her power was gone, overwhelmed by the sheer force of the Duke's technique. His rapier stayed steady while the storm of aura around him grew fiercer. The monster staggered back, collapsing beneath the invisible torrent of thrusts. Tentacles were shredded into mist, and hundreds of eyes burst and dissolved into nothingness. Her cries shifted from madness to horror as her life slipped away. No, no, I was chosen. The everlasting dream cannot. The words never finished. The Duke's aura pressed harder, and her body collapsed inward. The countless thrusts of energy converged until the grotesque shell could no longer hold together. The abomination imploded in silence, leaving only a fine black powder carried off by the night wind. When the light cleared, nothing remained. No flesh, no abyssal energy, no trace of the witch. The barrier that had enclosed the courtyard flickered and went out, letting the natural moonlight spill through. The Duke stood at the center of the ruins with his rapier lowered at his side. His posture had not changed, as though the battle had demanded nothing of him. The white aura surrounding him dimmed and faded into the night. Did someone disable the shield from inside? Roland wondered as he watched the barrier dissolve. He had assumed the Duke had left someone within to bring it down. On the far end of the courtyard, a mass of soldiers appeared, ready to charge yet waiting for their commander's signal. Just as Roland had expected, the entire scheme had been a poorly executed plan. A decoy had acted as the Duke while the real one waited outside. Once the relics were activated, the one ordered to disable the shield must have been caught in the illusion. He thought to himself as silence settled over the aftermath of the battle. From the very beginning of this incident, he had known that something was wrong. The Duke who appeared in the hall was an impostor, perhaps not even a true living being. Even when his bracelet was activated, there had always been a sense that something was out of place. Roland's thoughts spiraled, but he forced his breathing to remain steady. His body ached, his mana reserves were nearly empty, and yet he could not allow himself to collapse here. The silence that followed the implosion was unbearable. It was not a moment of relief but a suffocating weight pressing down on him and on the survivors. The soldiers who remained standing looked at the Duke with a mixture of reverence and fear. No one dared to speak before the mighty Tier 4 class holder made his move. "Ingram, take care of the rest, secure the main palace." Suddenly, his voice boomed across the entire courtyard. It was not loud, yet every soldier heard it clearly. The Duke did not need to shout. His aura carried authority, and soon, with perfect unison, all of his soldiers answered. "Yes, Your Grace." Grand Knight Commander Ingram stepped forward from the ranks. His crimson cloak swept behind him, heavy with dust but still gleaming. The polished plates of his armor caught the pale moonlight that now spilled into the courtyard, and his great sword rested easily on his shoulder. Although the Duke had already decided the battle by himself, Ingram's presence was still undeniable. "Form ranks. Shields forward. Lances out. More cultists may be near. Restrain everyone." His command cut through the silence, and hundreds of soldiers surged into action. Even nobles were restrained without exception. Roland did not resist. He simply raised his hands and yielded. There was no use in running, and there was no reason to fight. The monster wave had ended, yet scattered enemies still lingered. Faint traces of abyssal energy clung to the courtyard, but with soldiers surrounding every corner, he was certain that no one would escape. "How preposterous! Do you know who I am? Do you even know who these people are?" "It is fine, Master Enzanus. My father's soldiers will not harm us." Julius spoke to the old mage, who had barely recovered from the attack. The mage's legs trembled, yet his mouth continued to move. The soldiers fanned out at Ingram's command. Roland studied their movements and formations, observing everything closely and recording what he could. His golems floated above, but the soldiers treated them as enemies and shot them down with arrows. Roland made no effort to stop them. "Clear the bodies. Watch the shadows and strike anything that moves." The man's voice rang through the night while the soldiers worked to secure the grounds. They moved with the precision of a machine. The gaping holes that the monsters had used to crawl inside were surrounded, and soldiers entered to investigate. Clerics arrived to heal the wounded and save whoever could still be saved. Many lives had already been lost in this strange gathering, and Roland wondered if Alexander Valerian bore some responsibility for the disaster. Roland, Arthur, and the others were ordered to relocate to the palace. As they walked, Roland's eyes lingered on the Duke, who stood motionless. His presence alone was commanding, and it seemed unnecessary for him to give any further orders as his men cleared everything on their own. Was this insane plan his idea? Once they returned inside the palace, Roland examined the damage. Scratches marked the walls, and a few bodies lay scattered, but the number of deaths was thankfully minimal. Roland had managed to lure the monsters away and direct one of the brothers to evacuate the nobles. Even so, there had not been enough time to save everyone, and some guards had been trampled by the surge of creatures that tried to reach the false Duke, who was being carried to safety. Was it some kind of puppet? Tybalt Valerian was present, and so was Theodore with his bodyguard. Along with them stood the guards who had pretended to be the Duke's protectors. The figure passed off as the Duke resembled a wooden puppet crafted through some spell to appear real. It was lifelike enough to deceive even Roland's sensors. However, it had seemingly malfunctioned after being exposed to abyssal magic and could not be awakened, even with the aid of its bracelet. The same bracelet was still on its wrist, and through it, he could analyze the structure. The data would have been useful if he had wanted to produce something similar, but his mind was elsewhere. The 5 brothers were now gathered in a large hall where the nobles were holding a party. All of them were involved in the incident, and their father had no qualms about putting them in danger. The atmosphere inside the hall was suffocating. The nobles who remained were pale, quiet, and trembling at what they had witnessed. Everyone was confused about the situation, but was not given time to rest. The 5 brothers stood apart from the crowd. Their father had not returned to them and had not offered even a single word of encouragement. Separate them. One of the commanding officers pointed at the brothers, and soldiers surrounded them. The greatest concentration was around Yvonne, the one who had been involved with the cultist witch. "Unhand me at once. Do you know who I am?" Yvonne protested, and so did his mother. "Let him go. Who do you think we are?" Nevertheless, he was dragged away by a group of soldiers, and so was she. Arthur and Roland suffered the same fate, and soon all of the nobility were led away into separate chambers. The castle was large and filled with rooms, as well as a dungeon. Fortunately, the place where he and Arthur ended up was rather comfortable and had several chairs for them to sit on. "When I came here, I did not expect this. At least Mother was not invited." Arthur mumbled as he took a seat. His hands trembled, and it was clear that he was struggling to process the situation. "What do you think?" "What do I think?" Roland looked out the window at the large moon and then turned back to Arthur. "I think your father might be a little insane." A pause followed, and Arthur let out a small chuckle. Soon, the two of them smiled at each other. The incident seemed to be drawing to an end, yet he was certain this would not be the last time the cultists appeared. They would need a convincing explanation for their actions during the chaos, since he was sure the Duke would be asking questions soon. The horizon burned gold and crimson as the first rays of the sun spilled across the rooftops of the battered palace. Roland sat by the window with his elbows resting on the arms of the chair. He watched the light creep into their room and slowly brighten it. Arthur sat beside him, slouched in his own chair, his face still stained with cultist blood. Neither of them had slept while they waited. "Looks almost peaceful," Arthur murmured as he watched soldiers running outside. "You would never guess what happened here." Roland adjusted his helmet and kept his eyes on the display. Small dots moved across the palace grounds while one large patch of static lingered in a particular location. The presence of a Tier 4 class holder still interfered with his sensors. "I am sure Mary will be furious with me. I hope she is doing fine," Arthur said again, his voice trailing away. Roland leaned out the window as he answered. "I am sure she is safe. Gareth and Morian are with her as well. It is only a matter of time before they call us for an explanation. Once that is over, I am sure we will be free to return to Albrook." "I hope so." The two men remained in place, waiting to be released. 2 guards stood outside the chamber, though the watch was not especially strict. No one believed they would be foolish enough to attempt an escape when soldiers filled the grounds. Even if they slipped past the sentries, the Duke and the Grand Knight Commander would end their flight with ease. Roland had gathered a wealth of data from the confrontation, material that would serve him well in the future. For now, though, the only thought in his mind was surviving this ordeal and returning to Albrook. The Duke struck him as a strange man, either careless enough to risk his sons' lives or so confident in his own power that he believed they could never be harmed. His strength was undoubtedly formidable, yet even he had been unable to break through the massive shield that protected the palace. Their stay here had been short, yet he already felt he had seen enough of this place to last a lifetime. Roland only wished to retreat into his workshop and vanish from the gaze of others, but he knew that such a thing was no longer possible. In this battle, he had revealed far too much and displayed abilities that no ordinary Tier 3 class holder of his level should have possessed. He was almost certain that his true name would soon be uncovered, if it had not already been. Is this it? What will the Duke do with me? That question weighed on him more than any other. Would the Duke compel him to return to the Central Kingdom and confront his father, or would he consider him a royalist spy? Roland's choices had been far from logical for a man of noble blood, and the most natural conclusion was espionage. If he were judged guilty of such treachery, the consequences would be severe. As he wrestled with these thoughts, a knock interrupted his brooding. A knight in polished yet dust-streaked armor stepped inside. He pushed the doors apart and performed a casual bow. "Lord Arthur, Sir Wayland. His Grace summons you both to the Great Hall. The rest of the young lords are already assembled. Please follow me." Both Roland and Arthur looked at each other and stood up from their chairs. The knight's boots rang against the stone floor as he led them through the corridors. The palace smelled faintly of smoke and charred wood, mingling with a hint of iron from blood that had not yet been scrubbed clean. Servants moved quietly, avoiding eye contact, and the guards they passed kept their visors low. It was as though the entire household held its breath as they awaited the Duke's judgment. Arthur straightened his back as they walked, though the weight of exhaustion clung to him. He cast a glance at Roland, who carried himself with calm composure. Although Roland wished to keep his helmet on, he removed it, since wearing it in the presence of the Duke was discouraged and its functions offered no real advantage here. His mask was gone as well, leaving him exposed with his face revealed to all. For the moment, no one seemed to recognize him as a member of the Arden estate. His father was still only a baron and usually kept himself hidden beneath heavy armor that covered his entire body, so perhaps Roland's identity would remain safe. They entered the great hall that had previously been hidden from them. The large doors and walls still bore claw marks, but some workers were already restoring them to their former state. Once inside, the first thing Roland noticed was the throne on the opposite end. Upon it, Duke Alexander Valerian sat with a flawless posture, his presence commanding the room. To his right stood the Grand Knight Commander, the man they had seen the day before, who had never drawn his sword in battle. To his left was someone new, an older man who appeared to be his chief aide. He whispered into the Duke's ear while holding a stack of papers, perhaps sharing information about Arthur and Roland, who were just arriving. The rest of the hall was spacious. The banners of House Valerian hung along the sides since this part of the castle had been untouched by the nightly attack. The 5 sons of Alexander Valerian stood before the throne, each with guards at their sides. Arthur and Roland were led to the end of the line. The atmosphere was tense, filled with restrained whispers from nobles who had been summoned to witness the inquiry. Some nobles stood along the sides while others, who seemed to hold a higher rank, occupied booths on the second floor. A clear difference in treatment was evident, and Roland quickly noticed it. Those standing below appeared to be the same nobles who had been present during the initial gathering, while those seated above were entirely different. It seemed they had known about the Duke's plan and had been kept safely away from the area under attack. Was that how he planned it? He pretended to lower his guard and let the cultists into his home. Quite ruthless. The longer Roland remained in this hall, the lower his opinion of the Duke became. The man appeared shrewd and indifferent even toward his closest kin. Perhaps there were other illegitimate children like Arthur scattered elsewhere, which would explain why the Duke did not truly fear for the survival of his 5 legitimate heirs. Someone would always remain to carry on the line. It seemed that as long as he believed his core of power was unshaken, he was willing to risk the lives of others. This thought made Roland recall his Tier 3 Ascension trial. At that time, he too had needed to become ruthless, form alliances, and at times sacrifice some of his forces in order to gain an advantage. That was one of the main reasons he had avoided involving himself with nobility, since the ruthlessness they displayed was deeply unsettling. Yet now he found himself in the middle of it all with no way to escape, and with the Duke standing before him to decide his fate. Alexander Valerian's gaze swept across his sons, lingering on each with a weight that made even Julius bow his head. His armor was held by the Grand Knight Commander and looked pristine as always. Roland could tell that the enchantments placed on it were not simple and were above the Tier 3 grade. When the Duke finally spoke, his voice was level and calm, yet carried a domineering power. "You did well in surviving the cult's onslaught. For that, you have my praise, however." The Duke's words rolled through the great hall, and no one dared to breathe. "Survival alone is not merit. I will hear of what transpired, and lies will not be tolerated. Do you understand?" He addressed everyone, and with their heads lowered his sons responded. "Yes, Your Grace." "Good. Ivan, stand." "Why yes, Your Grace." His eyes settled first on Ivan, who stood up, his body trembling despite trying to hold his head up. Guards held him firmly by the arms. Alexander's stare cut into him like a blade, and it was clear that his fate would be different. "You, Ivan. You consorted with the witch. You opened the gates of my house to those wretched beings." Ivan stammered, his voice breaking. "Why Your Grace, I was deceived. She had taken the form of my wife. I did not know, please forgive. Silence. The Duke's tone struck like a whip, and Yvonne could not continue speaking. Everyone felt it as well, some force that crushed their voices and prevented them from speaking, a power that most likely belonged to the Duke. You consorted with a witch. You jeopardized the safety of your kin, your people, and this house. No deception can excuse such weakness. You will answer for this. Ivan's knees buckled, but the guards at his side forced him to remain upright. Murmurs rippled among the nobles standing along the walls, yet no one dared to raise a voice. The Duke leaned back in his chair, his frown deepening. You are my blood, but blood does not grant you immunity from punishment. The Valyrian name is like adamantium, and adamantium does not break. Ivan's fate was sealed with those words, and the Duke continued. From this day forth, your title will be stripped, and your lands will be divided among your brothers and the other nobles. Ivan's head snapped up, his face pale as parchment. He could not accept what he heard, and even the guards struggled to restrain the strength of a third-tier warrior. Your Grace. Father, please. You cannot. The Duke raised a single finger, and Ivan's voice died in his throat as though an invisible hand had seized it. The guards dragged him back into line. Whispers passed among the nobility in the upper booths while those standing at the sides remained silent. Let this be known to all present. Weakness of will cannot be tolerated. Direct bloodline or not, it shall not stain the name of House Valyrian. Let his punishment serve as a reminder. The nobles bowed their heads, though many faces revealed satisfaction. More than a few had likely awaited Ivan's downfall for years. Once Yvonne was gone, only 4 brothers remained. Roland expected Julius to be called next, but the Duke's gaze fell on him instead. A shiver ran down his spine as he sensed an attempt to read his status. His gear was made to prevent it, but he wasn't sure if the Duke couldn't peer through it. The feeling soon passed, and the Duke turned his eyes toward Arthur. Now. The matter of you. Arthur stiffened as his father's gaze fixed on him. He rose immediately and bowed low. Roland, still only his knight, did not expect to be addressed. He had already spoken of the cultist attack and shared his theories, but it was Arthur who would need to carry them through this trial. Your participation in the current incident cannot be ignored. You stood your ground, fought beside your brothers, and survived. That is expected of one who claims the Valyrian name. But... His words lingered in the air for a moment, but soon he got to the point. Your knight was the one who unraveled the mystery of the relic. Is that correct? Arthur's eyes flicked toward Roland and soon turned toward his father. Finally, he met the man's gaze, but after a moment, he lowered his head as he began to talk. Yes, Your Grace. Sir Wayland had met with these cultists in the past and developed a way to counter their occult relics. He did? Interesting. Explain. The Duke's eyebrow was raised. It was clear that his people had informed him about the whole incident. There were probably some monitoring devices using magic in the palace to see what had transpired during the night. Of course. Arthur swallowed his saliva as he tried to recall what Roland had told him to say. Sir Wayland was involved in one particular incident. I am certain Your Grace will remember it, the one that took place near the city of Rika. No one interrupted him as Arthur recounted a shortened account of Roland's involvement in helping the church acquire the large relic in the cultist village. The city Yvonne was managing was mentioned as well, along with his work with the church to develop a method of countering the effects of the relics. For a moment, silence filled the hall. Roland remained kneeling on the ground while his exploits were retold. It was a strange experience to hear others recount his deeds, yet the story sounded less exaggerated when the Solarian Church and the Grand Inquisitor were included. Fascinating. Arthur was visibly surprised at his father's response. The old man seemed completely absorbed in the retelling, and even though it took several minutes, he did not interrupt once. So the church bass, the church knew. The Duke mumbled quietly and tapped the armrest a few times. His expression did not shift, yet his words were clear, and they confirmed Roland's earlier suspicion that the Duke had no real knowledge of how to counter the relics. Regular illusory magic defenses would not work, for there was a particular method of awakening them. Can your knight repeat this method? He can, Your Grace. I see. Alexander Valyrian thought for a moment and soon came to some kind of decision. Then it is only fitting that your deeds and your knights be rewarded. He helped with resolving this issue greatly. Speak, Arthur. What is it you desire from me? Arthur hesitated. His lips parted, then closed again. The hall waited in silence, and even Roland glanced at him, curious to see what he would ask for. After a long pause, Arthur finally spoke. "I wish to see my mother." A ripple of surprise passed through the chamber. Some of the nobles muttered, others frowned. Of all the rewards he might have claimed, gold, land, titles, he asked only that. Alexander's brows drew together slightly. "Your mother." He leaned back against his throne. "That is no reward. You shall have it regardless, in due time. I ask again, Arthur Valerian. What is it that you truly want?" Arthur looked down, his hands tightening into fists. It was clear that he didn't appreciate what the nobles thought about him. Nevertheless, he raised his head again and asked for something more probable. "Then, Your Grace. I ask that the lands we won from Brother Theodore be rightfully granted to me. My men and I fought for them, bled for them. Let them be ours by law and title." This time, Theodore was taken aback. He was forced to remain silent, yet it was clear that he was enraged. During the culling, his lands had been taken from him, and the matter had never been resolved. The reward they requested was reasonable given their current standing, and it seemed that the Duke agreed. "So be it. The lands of Theodore shall be yours." "Thank you, Your Grace." Alexander Valerian looked at the old man beside him and whispered something into his ear. The man nodded, moved aside, and spoke with a few guards. Soon they returned, and the Duke explained. "Your knight will disclose the intricacies of this relic to my men. The mages and enchanters must be taught their workings so that such an infiltration cannot happen again. The commander will assign you an escort, and the knight will share all that he knows." Arthur nodded and prepared to leave, but his father continued. "Once we are finished here, you are free to wander these halls. Someone will lead you to your mother. That is all, you may go." Arthur gave a quick bow and moved away. Roland glanced at the group approaching him. He could not remain to hear the Duke address the other three brothers, but not that he cared. He soon turned toward a group of mages who were waiting for him. It was clear that until he disclosed everything he knew and perhaps helped them create a working prototype, he would not be able to leave. "Why is it always me? I just want to go home." He was tired, he wanted to sleep, but more than anything, he wished to see his wife and Wolf. Well, at least Arthur will get to meet his mother. For a moment, his thoughts drifted, but in the end, this was not such a bad outcome. Everyone he had come with was alive and well. The Duke, although stern, did not seem too angry at his presence. Now Roland needed to take what he had learned today and turn his thoughts toward reaching new heights, for unless he advanced to Tier 4, his freedom would never be achieved.